The wagon wheel had cracked clean through, and Gertrude Thatcher had been sitting on the side of the dusty Nevada road for 4 hours when she finally stopped counting the riders who passed her by. She had counted 17. 17 men on horseback, each one slowing just enough to take in the sight of her. A woman alone, her dark hair escaping its pins in the afternoon heat, her green dress torn at the hem where it had caught on the broken axle, her face streaked with dust and something dangerously close to desperation. Each one of those 17 riders had done the exact same thing. They had looked at her. They had tipped their hats, a brief, polite lift of the brim, a gesture that meant everything and nothing all at once, and then they had ridden on. Every single one of them. Every rider tipped his hat and kept going. It was the 18th rider who stopped. She did not hear him approach at first because she had stopped listening. She had turned her back to the road and was wrestling with the leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world: 3 dresses, a daguerreotype of her mother, $42 in coin, a letter she had read so many times the creases were nearly holes, and a secret that could destroy a man she had never met. She was not crying. She had decided sometime around the 12th rider that she was not going to cry, that she was going to figure this out herself because that was what she had always done, what she had learned to do when her father drank and her mother prayed, and the farm in Ohio went slowly to ruin around them. "Ma'am." The voice came from behind her, and she spun around so fast she nearly lost her footing on the gravel, catching herself on the wagon's side. He was already dismounting, this stranger, not waiting for her permission or her acknowledgement, his boots hitting the ground with a sound like finality. He was taller than she had expected somehow, as though the landscape had not prepared her for the scale of him, with dark hair pushed back beneath a battered hat and eyes that were neither brown nor green but something complicated in between. "Are you all right?" he asked, and then he seemed to hear how inadequate that question was, because he looked at the broken wheel and then back at her and said, "No, I can see you are not. Do you need help? Do you need help?" 4 simple words that 17 men had been perfectly capable of not saying. Gertrude Thatcher straightened her spine and looked at this man, this David Merritt, though she did not know his name yet, did not know the dark past that rode with him as surely as his saddlebags, did not know the secrets he kept folded tight as old letters, and she made a decision that would change everything. "Yes," she said, "I believe I do." 3 weeks earlier, Gertrude had stepped off the stage in Elko, Nevada, with $47 and a plan that was either brilliant or catastrophic, and she had not yet decided which. The plan had a name. His name was Raymond Polk, and he was, according to the letter she had received in answer to her advertisement in the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, a successful rancher with 200 acres, a fine house, and a sincere desire to find a wife of good Christian character and practical disposition. He had written eloquently. He had described sunsets over the Ruby Mountains that sounded almost poetic. He had promised her a life of stability and purpose, which was the closest thing to love that Gertrude had allowed herself to want for a very long time. She had not written back about her own secrets. She had not mentioned what had happened in Cincinnati. She had not mentioned the name Aldous Creed, or the money, or the reason she could not stay in Ohio any longer even if she had wanted to. She had simply agreed to come. Elko in September of 1882 was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. The Central Pacific Railroad had made it a going concern, and the cattle trade had given it ambition, but it still had the raw, unfinished quality of a place that had not yet made up its mind. Gertrude had stood on the main street with her satchel and breathed in the smell of sage and horse and wood smoke, and told herself this was the beginning of something new. Raymond Polk had been waiting for her at the stage office. He was older than his letters had implied, perhaps 50, though he might have been 40 and simply weathered, with a broad, flat face and small eyes that moved quickly, assessing. He had looked at her the way a man looks at livestock he is considering purchasing, and Gertrude had felt the first cold finger of doubt trace itself along her spine. "Gertrude Thatcher," he had said, not as a question but as a confirmation of an inventory item. "Mr. Polk," she had replied, and shook his hand, and the cold finger pressed harder. He had given her a room at the Silver Star Hotel and told her they would be married in 2 weeks, once he had arranged matters with the pastor in town. He had not asked whether 2 weeks suited her. He had not asked much of anything, really. He had simply outlined the terms of what he clearly considered to be a business arrangement, and then tipped his own hat, the very gesture that would come to haunt her, and walked away. Gertrude had sat on the edge of the hotel bed that night and done something she did very rarely. She had allowed herself to feel afraid. She had come too far to go back. Ohio held nothing for her now except the memory of Aldous Creed, and the accusations he had made, false accusations. Every one of them, but he was a powerful man and she was nobody. And in Cincinnati in 1882, that was all that mattered. She had taken money from his household accounts, yes, but it had been her own wages, months of them unpaid, and she had taken only what was owed her. He had called it theft. He had friends in the law. She had run. So going back was not a possibility. Raymond Polk with his flat face and his assessing eyes would have to do, except that in the 10 days following her arrival, Raymond Polk had revealed himself to be something considerably worse than simply cold. He was controlling in a way that had a pattern to it, a practiced quality, as though he had done this before. He told her how to dress when she accompanied him to the general store. He corrected the way she spoke to the shopkeeper's wife. He had a temper that he kept carefully leashed in public and let off the leash in private, and though he had not touched her, not yet, the threat of it lived in the room whenever they were alone together. On the 11th day, she had overheard a conversation she was not meant to hear. She had been in the kitchen of his ranch house. He had brought her out to show her the property, to show her what she was agreeing to, and she had gone to fetch water from the pump while he spoke with his foreman on the porch. She had come back around the side of the house and stopped when she heard her own name. "The Thatcher woman will sign the papers once we're married," Raymond was saying. "She's got nobody and nothing. She'll do what I tell her. And if she doesn't," the foreman's voice rough as gravel, "then she'll do what I tell her anyway," Raymond had said, and then laughed, and that laugh was the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. She had walked back to the pump. She had stood there for a long moment with the cold water running over her hands, and then she had made a new plan. She had gone back inside and smiled and eaten dinner and said nothing, and that night she had packed her satchel and written a note, brief, polite, final, and taken the horse from the small stable at the back of the property. She had not thought of it as stealing. She had thought of it as necessity. She had ridden hard through the night and the early morning, and then, when the horse had begun to flag and the wagon road had presented itself as a better option, she had seen the wagon sitting unattended outside a small homestead with what looked like fresh provisions loaded in the back. She had told herself she would send money back for the horse and the wagon when she could. And then the wheel had cracked somewhere between nowhere and nowhere else, and she had sat down in the dust and waited, and 17 men had tipped their hats and kept going, until David Merritt. He worked on the wheel with a quiet, focused efficiency that Gertrude found both calming and irritating, because she was not accustomed to being helped and did not entirely know what to do with it. He had produced tools from his saddlebags, a proper toolkit, which struck her as unusual, and was examining the damage with the serious attention of a man who built things rather than simply rode past them. "The spoke is gone clean through," he said. "I can get you mobile, but it will not hold for more than 10 miles. You will need a wheelwright." "There is one in Elko," Gertrude said before she could stop herself, and then bit her lip, because Elko was precisely where she did not want to go. David Merritt looked up at her from where he was crouched beside the wheel. His hat was pushed back on his head, and the afternoon light hit his face without mercy and without flattery, and she saw that he was not so much handsome as he was honest-looking. That was the word that came to her. His face was the kind that kept its promises. "You are heading away from Elko," he observed. "Yes." "On a road that leads to Carlin, which is 40 miles and a broken wheel away." "Yes," she said again. He was quiet for a moment, turning a spoke in his hands. "Is there someone in Elko you are trying to avoid?" Gertrude looked at this man she had known for approximately 12 minutes and felt the truth pressing against the inside of her chest like something trying to get out. She pressed back. "That is a personal matter," she said. "Of course," he said immediately, without any of the offense or curiosity she had expected, and went back to work. She watched him for a moment. "You are very calm," she said. "I try to be." "Most men who stop to help a woman on the road are either trying to rob her or court her," she said, because she had learned that the best way to know what a person was planning was to say the uncomfortable thing and watch their reaction. He did not flinch. He did not laugh nervously. He looked up at her with those complicated eyes and said simply, "I stopped because you were in trouble and no one else had. That is the whole of it." She studied him. "What is your name?" "David Merritt." He paused. "And yours, if I may ask?" "Gertrude Thatcher." He nodded as though her name meant something, or perhaps as though he was simply committing it to memory. He went back to the wheel. She sat on a rock and watched him work and felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a name for yet, only that it was warm and slightly frightening, like holding a match too close to your fingertips. They reached Carlin before sundown. David had tied his horse behind the wagon and driven it himself, and Gertrude had sat beside him on the bench with her satchel in her lap, and the vast Nevada sky spreading out above them in shades of orange and violet and pink that she might have found beautiful if she had not been so focused on not thinking about how close his shoulder was to hers. He had not pressed her with questions. He had told her when she asked that he was heading to Carlin to pick up a shipment of lumber and had told her the story behind it easily, without the evasiveness of a man with something to hide, which told her, paradoxically, that he probably did have something to hide, because no one who lived in the West was entirely free of secrets. But he wore his honesty like good cloth, well fitted. He had built a cabin on 40 acres east of Carlin, he told her. He had come from Missouri 3 years ago after he paused there just briefly after some personal difficulties. He was building a life. He liked the work of it. "What kind of personal difficulties?" she asked and then shook her head. "Forgive me, I have no right to pry." "You have every right to know who is sitting next to you," he said. "My wife died 3 years ago. Fever took her in the spring." Gertrude was quiet. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was a good woman." There was love in his voice when he said it, clean and simple love without bitterness, and that told her more about his character than anything else he could have said. In Carlin, he helped her find a room at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Elaine Forsyth, who had the squared shoulders and no-nonsense manner of a woman who had survived considerable difficulty and come out the other side with her dignity intact. Mrs. Forsyth looked at Gertrude and then at David and made a swift, accurate assessment. "1 room," she said to Gertrude. "You look like you need feeding and a night's sleep." "I do," Gertrude agreed. David paid for the room before Gertrude could object. She objected anyway. "I have money," she said, low and direct. "I know you do," he said. "Keep it. You may need it more than I will." She wanted to argue. She swallowed the argument instead. "I will repay you," she said. "Only if you want to," he said, and tipped his hat. That gesture that had come to mean so many different things over the course of this impossible day, and went to see about his lumber. Gertrude sat in the room that night with her $42 and her daguerreotype and her torn creased letter and her secret, and she thought about Raymond Polk and what he would do when he found her gone. She thought about Aldous Creed in Cincinnati and the accusations that were probably still following her like a shadow. She thought about the 17 riders who had tipped their hats and kept going, and she thought about David Merritt. She told herself she was being foolish. She had known the man for less than an afternoon. She was in a precarious situation and she was lonely and he had been kind, and women in precarious situations and loneliness were inclined to romanticize kindness into something larger. She knew this about herself. She had always been able to diagnose her own weaknesses with clinical precision, which had never once prevented her from having them. She went to sleep. In the morning, she went to the dining room for breakfast and found David already there, sitting with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, reading a 2-week-old copy of the Reno Gazette-Journal. He looked up when she came in and rose from his seat, which was the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that she associated with men raised by good mothers, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit with me if you like," he said, "or not if you would rather be alone." She sat. Mrs. Forsythe brought her coffee and eggs and biscuits and gave David a look that clearly said she approved of him and expected him to behave accordingly. "I need to decide what to do," Gertrude said, not as an invitation for advice but as a statement of fact, the kind she had always found it useful to say aloud because it made the thing more real. "That is often the case in the mornings," David agreed. She almost smiled. "I cannot go back to Elko." "Then do not go back to Elko. I have no particular reason to stay in Carlin." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "What is in Elko that you are avoiding?" She looked at him across the table in the early morning light, this man with his honest face and his lumber shipment and his dead wife's name spoken without bitterness, and she made another decision. "A man I was meant to marry," she said, "who is not a good man." David's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it solidified the way metal sets when it cools. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically, but he would have." "How do you know?" "Because I listened," she said, "and I paid attention, and I have known men like Raymond Polk before, and I know how those stories end." David nodded slowly. He did not tell her she might be wrong. He did not suggest she might have misunderstood. He believed her, and the straightforwardness of that belief hit her somewhere unexpectedly deep. "Is he likely to come looking?" he asked. "I do not know. I took his horse." She paused. "And his wagon, though that was an accident. The point is, I left without permission, and I suspect a man like Raymond Polk finds that intolerable." "He would not be the first," David said carefully. "This territory has a sheriff in Elko and another in Carlin. If he comes here making trouble, there are people who can handle it." "Can they?" Gertrude said, and there was more edge in her voice than she had intended, the edge that came from knowing that the law's interest in protecting women depended very largely on who was making the complaint and who had the money. David heard it. He was quiet for a moment. "Not always," he said honestly, "but sometimes." She appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated a reassurance. The lumber that David had come to collect was a significant order, enough timber to frame an addition to the cabin he had described, which told her he was either planning to expand his operation or expecting company of some kind. She did not ask. They spent the morning in the town together without precisely planning to, and she found that she liked the way he moved through a space, unhurried but not slow, purposeful but not impatient. He introduced her to the wheelwright, a cheerful German immigrant named Heinrich Baumann, who examined the wagon wheel with the reverence of a craftsman looking at a worthy problem, and told her the wheel could be replaced by the next morning. "I do not actually need the wagon," Gertrude said, and then realized she had spoken the problem aloud. "I took it from someone I should not have taken it from. I should send it back." "Who does it belong to?" David asked. She explained awkwardly. She had taken it from a homestead outside Elko in the dark of night, intending to use it to get to the stage road, not quite thinking through the implications. She had been running, and running people were not always their most logical. David thought about this. "I can arrange to have it returned," he said. "I know people who pass through that area regularly." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because you have a problem and it is one I can help solve," he said, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. Gertrude Thatcher, who had grown up in a house where help had to be earned and sometimes even then did not come, felt something shift in the architecture of her assumptions about the world. "I have a proposition," she said before she could lose her nerve. He waited. "I have $42, she said. "I am practical, I am organized, I can cook and keep accounts, and I have some skill with horses. I am looking for work. Not the kind of situation I left in Elko, but genuine employment. Do you need help with your operation? He studied her for a long moment. There was no condescension in it, no amusement. He was thinking, actually thinking, treating her proposal as a serious one. My cabin is small, he said carefully. It would not be appropriate by most standards for a woman to live there without— I understand the conventions, she said. Mrs. Forsyth has 2 other rooms. I can board here and work your land during the days. He was quiet. The work is hard. I am not going to pretend otherwise. 40 acres in the Nevada high desert is not gentle. I am not gentle, she said. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. No, he said. I can see that. He said yes. Over the following 3 weeks, Gertrude Thatcher learned the shape of David Merritt's life, and it was different from what she had expected. The cabin was small but well made, with the careful joinery of a man who took pride in the work his hands produced. He had a kitchen garden that was struggling but alive, a small herd of cattle, 12 head, a start rather than an establishment, and a relationship with the land that was contemplative, almost philosophical. He did not talk at the land the way some ranchers did, the men who treated the Nevada desert as an adversary to be conquered. He seemed to listen to it instead. She did the bookkeeping first, because that was the most immediate need. His accounts were technically accurate but haphazardly organized, the record of a man who understood numbers but not the systems they needed to live in. She reorganized everything in 3 days, created a ledger that would serve him for years, and when she showed him the results, he looked at the neat columns with the expression of someone who has discovered a room in their own house they did not know existed. Where did you learn to do this? He asked. I kept accounts for a household in Cincinnati, she said, which was true and also carefully incomplete. She did not tell him about Aldous Creed. Not yet. The secret sat in her like a stone she was carrying, and she was not yet ready to set it down, because setting it down meant trusting someone with it, and trust was something she had learned to build slowly and carefully, the way you build a fire in the wind. She cooked, and she mended, and she learned the particular personalities of his 12 cattle with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything, and she found that she was happy in a way she had not been for a long time. Not perfectly happy. There was still the fear, still the awareness that Raymond Polk was somewhere back there in Elko with his flat face and his assessing eyes, and possibly a complaint filed with the sheriff about a stolen horse. Still the shadow of Cincinnati. But within the work and the clean desert air and the company of this quiet, honest man, something in her was unclenching. And David. She was not entirely sure when she had started thinking of him simply as David, rather than David Merritt or Mr. Merritt, only that it had happened and she had not stopped it. She was not sure when she had started to notice that she was aware of where he was in a room, that the sound of his boots on the porch in the morning produced something embarrassingly close to anticipation. She was not sure when she had begun to listen for the particular quality of his silence, which was different from other men's silences. His was full rather than empty, thinking rather than vacant. She was, in short, falling in love with him, and she recognized it with the kind of clear-eyed horror of a woman who has very specifically decided not to do that particular thing. She told herself, "You are in a vulnerable position. You are grateful to him. You are lonely." These are well-known conditions that produce feelings that do not mean what they appear to mean. She told herself this every morning. Every evening, when he came to dinner at Mrs. Forsyth's and sat across from her, and spoke about the cattle or the weather or the book he was reading, David Merritt read books, actual books, which he received on a somewhat random schedule by mail from a bookshop in San Francisco. Every evening the argument she had made in the morning was a little less convincing. On the 23rd day, Raymond Polk rode into Carlin. Gertrude saw him from the window of Mrs. Forsyth's dining room, and the sight of him dropped through her like cold water. He was riding his best horse, and he had 2 men with him that she did not recognize, and his flat face had the controlled fury of a man who has been making himself wait for this. She did not panic. She had survived worse than Raymond Polk. She reminded herself of this firmly, and the only thing panic accomplished was clouding the judgment you needed most. She went to the kitchen and found Mrs. Forsyth. "There is a man in town looking for me," she said. "His name is Raymond Polk. He is from Elko. He is going to say I stole from him." Mrs. Forsyth set down the dish she was drying with the deliberate care of a woman who has heard enough stories to know which way this one was going. "Did you? I took a horse and a wagon because he was the kind of man who talks about women the way he talks about livestock," Gertrude said, "and I made a choice to leave before the situation became dangerous." Mrs. Forsyth picked the dish back up. "The horse has been returned," she said. "Your Mr. Merritt arranged it 10 days ago." Gertrude blinked. "He told you that?" "He did not have to tell me. I am not a woman who misses things." Mrs. Forsyth gave her a look. "The wagon was returned at the same time to the homestead you mentioned. Henry Caldwell, the farmer you took it from, decent man, took it as it was intended. No complaint made." The relief was substantial but brief, because Raymond Polk was still riding down the main street of Carlin, and no returned horse or wagon changed what he represented. "Does Mr. Polk have anything on you that is legitimate?" Mrs. Forsyth asked, with the crisp precision of a woman who had perhaps navigated her own difficulties with the law. "No," Gertrude said, "nothing legitimate." "Then he has a complaint without a crime," Mrs. Forsyth said, "which is just a man with a grudge on a horse." "A man with a grudge and 2 men beside him," Gertrude said. "Yes," Mrs. Forsyth agreed. "That part is more concerning." David came to the boarding house 20 minutes later, which told her that he had seen Polk ride in and had already made connections she had not shared with him. He came to the back door, the sensible door, and Mrs. Forsyth let him in with the nod of a woman who approves of sensible approaches. He found Gertrude in the kitchen and looked at her and said, "He is asking about you at the saloon." "I know. What does he want?" And Gertrude, who had been carrying the stone of her secrets for long enough and was very tired of the weight of it, sat down at Mrs. Forsyth's kitchen table and told him everything. She told him about Cincinnati and Aldous Creed and the wages that had gone unpaid for 4 months, about the way Creed had accused her of theft when she had taken what was owed her, about the friends he had in the law who had made it clear that staying in Cincinnati was not a safe option. She told him about the advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette and Raymond Polk's eloquent letter, and the crushing reality of the man versus his correspondence. She told him about the conversation she had overheard on the porch, the one that had made her run. She told him all of it, looking at the kitchen table rather than at him, her hands flat on the wood, and when she was done she looked up. David was looking at her with the focused, quiet attention he brought to everything, and there was nothing in his face that she could interpret as judgment. There was something else there, something that she was afraid to name. "You took your own wages," he said. "Yes." "And he called it theft." "Yes." "And you have been running from that ever since." "Yes," she said, and the word felt like setting down something heavy. "Gertrude," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice, her full name, not shortened or prettied, was different from how anyone else said it. "There is nothing in what you have told me that changes anything." She stared at him. "I brought trouble to your door." "Trouble finds doors," he said. "That is what trouble does. The question is what you do with it when it arrives." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you propose to do?" He thought about it seriously, which was very David. "I propose we go speak to Sheriff Tate," he said, "together, and we tell him what you have told me. Polk can make a complaint, he is within his rights to do so, but if he cannot substantiate a crime, the sheriff is not going to do anything more than hear him out. And I think, from what I know of Hal Tate, he is not a man who is easily impressed by a rancher with money and a grievance. And if he is, then we handle what comes next when it comes," David said, with a steadiness that she felt in her own chest like a borrowed heartbeat. "But I would rather start with the legal approach." She nodded. She stood. She straightened her spine. They went to the sheriff together. Sheriff Harold Tate was a stocky man in his late 40s with a gray mustache and the eyes of someone who had seen enough human foolishness to maintain a healthy skepticism about all parties in any dispute. He listened to Gertrude's account with careful attention, asked several precise questions, and made notes. He asked about Cincinnati with the same precision, and she told him what she could. "Mr. Polk is, I understand, at the saloon," Tate said when she was done. "That is my understanding as well," David said. "He has not come to me with a complaint," Tate said, "which is interesting. If he believed he had a legal case, the first place he would go is this office." "Perhaps he intends a more informal resolution," Gertrude said carefully. Tate's mustache shifted. "If his resolution is informal enough to create a problem, that becomes my business," he said. "I will have a conversation with Mr. Polk. In the meantime, Miss Thatcher, you are not wanted on any charge I have been made aware of, and you are a resident of this town in good standing. You have nothing to fear from the law." Gertrude thanked him. She shook his hand. She walked out into the Carlin afternoon sun and stood for a moment with her eyes closed and breathed. David stood beside her without speaking, which was the exactly correct thing to do. "Thank you," she said. "You did that yourself," he said. "I only walked beside you." She opened her eyes and looked at him in the afternoon light, this man who had stopped when 17 others had not, who had believed her when most would not, who had returned a horse she had taken and said nothing about it, who walked beside rather than ahead. "David," she said, and then could not immediately find the rest of the sentence. He waited. "I am not very good at this," she said. "At what? At any of this." She gestured vaguely, which encompassed more than the street. "At accepting help, at trusting people, at—" She stopped. "At feeling something you did not plan to feel," he said very quietly. The afternoon light was golden, and the sage smell carried on the warm breeze, and there were horses at the hitch rail, and a dog sleeping in the shade of the hardware store's awning, and Gertrude Thatcher looked at David Merritt and felt the last of the stone she had been carrying dissolve into something entirely different. "Yes," she said. "That." He reached out and took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw it, and she did not. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and it held hers with a firmness that was not possessive but was something better, certain. "I am not good at it either," he said. "For what it is worth. I was not planning to feel any of this. I was planning to pick up my lumber and go home." "I know," she said, and she almost laughed, and the almost laugh was half relief and half joy and half something she still did not quite have the word for. Raymond Polk left Carlin the following morning. Sheriff Tate had apparently been persuasive, and whatever informal resolution Polk had been considering had not in the end seemed worth the trouble of a man like Hal Tate with a legal obligation and a clear sense of jurisdiction. She heard he rode back to Elko, and she thought about him for approximately one more day and then set him aside. The way you set aside a book you have determined is not worth finishing. What remained was David. And what remained was the question of what exactly she was doing with her life, which had not been answered by the escape from Elko, or the flight down the wagon road, or the arrival in Carlin. She had work, she had a room, she had $42, and she had a man who held her hand with a certainty that made her feel like the ground was solid. But she had not quite made a plan. She was sitting with this question on a Sunday afternoon in October, on the wooden bench outside Mrs. Forsythe's that overlooked the main street and the brown hills beyond, when David came and sat beside her. He was carrying a book, the latest one from San Francisco, something about the history of the Roman Republic that he had been working through for 2 weeks, and he set it on his knee and looked at the hills. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About the addition," he said. "The lumber I collected, I have been trying to decide what shape to give it." Gertrude looked at the hills. "A sensible shape, I should think. I had a thought," he said carefully, "about a kitchen, larger than the one I have, with a window that faces east because the morning light there is very fine." She was quiet. "And perhaps a room that could serve as a sitting room or a library if one had books enough, which I am working on." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the hills, but the angle of his jaw was doing something that told her he knew she was looking at him and was deciding how to proceed. "David," she said. "I know this is," he began, and then stopped and started again in the way of a man who has rehearsed something and then discovered the rehearsal was insufficient. "I know there are practical considerations. I know you are a woman who makes her own way and does not need— I am not implying that you need David," she said again, more gently. He looked at her finally. "I do not want you to go," he said simply. "When you have the means and the desire to go, I mean. I am aware that Carlin is not, that this was not your destination. I am aware that you had a life you were trying to build, and what happened in Elko was not that life, but perhaps there is a life you are still looking for. I am saying that if the life you are looking for could be here, I would like very much for it to be here." Gertrude Thatcher looked at David Merritt and thought about the 17 riders who had tipped their hats and kept going. She thought about Cincinnati and Aldous Creed and the accusations she had outrun. She thought about Raymond Polk and his flat face and the conversation she had overheard on the porch. She thought about all the versions of her life that had not worked out, and the woman she had become in the navigating of them, practical and careful, and a little too accustomed to carrying her own weight and calling that sufficient. And she thought about a kitchen with a window facing east and the morning light on the Nevada hills and a man who read history books and held her hand with certainty and believed her without requiring proof. "The life I am looking for," she said slowly, "has a morning kitchen in it and books, and someone who keeps their promises." "I keep my promises," he said, with a quiet intensity that she recognized as the most important thing he had ever said. "I know," she said. "That is the thing that frightens me most about you." He reached for her hand again. "Will you let me be frightening then, on a permanent basis?" She smiled, and it was the first entirely unguarded smile she had produced in longer than she could accurately remember, and she felt it all the way through. "I will consider it my primary occupation," she said. He kissed her then, on the bench outside Mrs. Forsythe's boarding house on a Sunday afternoon in October of 1882, with the brown Nevada hills watching and the sage smell on the breeze, and it was the kiss of a man who meant it completely and had been waiting for the exactly right moment, which was this one. Mrs. Forsythe, who was most certainly watching from the window, made no comment. She did, however, produce an exceptionally good supper that evening. They were married in November in the Carlin church, with Mrs. Forsythe and Heinrich Baumann, the wheelwright and sheriff, Hal Tate as witnesses, because these were the people who had been present during the most important moments of the preceding 2 months, and it seemed only right. The pastor was a young man named Reverend Collins who had a tendency to use more words than were strictly necessary in his sermons, but performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Gertrude wore her least-torn dress, which was the blue one, and had done her hair more carefully than usual, and when David saw her come down the aisle of the small church, they had not followed the convention of him waiting at the altar without seeing her first, because they had both agreed they were too old for theatrical surprises. He had looked at her with an expression that was worth every single thing she had been through to arrive at this moment. "You look like someone who has decided something," he said quietly when she reached him. "I have decided everything," she said. "Let us proceed." The winter of 1882 was harsher than usual in the Nevada high desert, and Gertrude discovered that 40 acres in a blizzard was a very different proposition from 40 acres in the autumn. The cabin, expanded now with David's lumber addition, was warm and solid, and she learned to appreciate the particular comfort of a well-made shelter when the wind was doing serious business outside. They worked together through those cold months with a partnership that she had not known was what she was looking for until she found it, a genuine working partnership, where both people's judgment was sought and given and considered. She ran the accounts. She was better at it than he was, and they both knew it. He built things. He was better at it than she was, and they both knew that too. He knew the cattle by temperament and could predict the weather from the look of certain clouds. She could negotiate a better price at the general store than he could, partly because she was smarter about it and partly because Mr. Griggs, the store owner, found her somewhat intimidating, which she considered a professional asset. She wrote in November to the authorities in Cincinnati. She had thought about this for a long time and had come to the conclusion that running was not the same as resolving, and that resolution was what she needed in order to be fully present in the life she was building. She wrote carefully and factually, documenting the months of unpaid wages, the amount she had taken, the manner in which Aldous Creed had characterized it. She sent the letter to a lawyer in Cincinnati whose name she had found in an old issue of the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, a man named Whitmore who had a reputation for honest dealing. The response came in January, which was a long wait but not a surprising one. Mr. Whitmore had looked into the matter. He had found with some investigation that Gertrude was not the only woman from the Creed household with a similar story. There were two others, both of whom had left under similar circumstances, neither of whom had yet found the courage to put anything in writing. With Gertrude's account and his own inquiries, Whitmore believed there was a case to be made. He would handle it if she was willing to provide a formal statement. She provided the statement. She sat at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the east window. David had built it exactly as he had described, and the light was indeed very fine, and she wrote out everything. It took 3 hours and 2 cups of coffee, and David, sitting quietly at the other end of the table with his Roman Republic, present without pressing, which was the exact quality of support she needed. She sent the statement, and then she went back to living her life, because she had learned that you could not wait for old things to resolve before you allowed new things to grow. You had to trust that the resolution would come in its own time, and meanwhile put your hands in the actual present. Aldous Creed, as it turned out, had accumulated enough trouble by 1883 that Gertrude's statement was one of several that contributed to a civil proceeding that ultimately resulted in him paying significant damages to 3 former employees, of whom Gertrude was one. She received a letter informing her of this in April of 1883, along with a bank draft for $68, which represented her unpaid wages with interest. She looked at the bank draft for a long time and then cried briefly, and then stopped crying and went to find David. He was in the east pasture mending fence, which was the kind of work that was always needing doing, and she walked out to him with the letter and the bank draft and showed him. He read the letter and looked at the draft and then looked at her. "It is finished," she said. "Yes," he said. "I had not entirely believed it would be," she admitted. He put his arm around her, right there in the east pasture with the February sage and the cold blue sky, and held her in the uncomplicated way of a man whose love was not contingent on anything. "I believed it," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That helped more than you know." She was, by April of 1883, expecting their first child, which she discovered in the practical, no-nonsense way of women in that era, a missed month, then another, the particular quality of morning nausea that was unlike any illness she had experienced, and a conversation with the doctor in Carlin who confirmed what she already knew. She told David that evening over supper and watched his face do something extraordinary, a transformation from his usual steady calm into something open and overwhelmed and deeply, helplessly glad. He covered her hands with his across the table. How are you feeling?" "Sick in the mornings," she said. "Fine otherwise. The doctor says I am healthy." "You are always healthy," he said, as though this were a personal accomplishment of hers. "I am always practical," she said. "Health is a consequence." He laughed, which was a sound she had come to consider one of the great rewards available in the world. He did not laugh easily or frequently, but when he did it was genuine and warm and slightly surprised, as though joy still managed to catch him off guard. "We will need to add another room," he said, the carpenter's mind already in motion. "Not yet," she said. "We have time." "I know," he said, "but I like having a project." The summer of 1883 was the best summer of Gertrude's life, which she recognized as a remarkable thing to be able to say at 28 years old. She was large and uncomfortable by August, but she did not stop working. She modified the work, took on more of the accounts and less of the physical labor, and discovered that she had opinions about interior arrangements and household management that David found genuinely interesting rather than obligatory to listen to. They talked about everything during those long summer evenings, sitting on the porch he had built facing the hills. He had built a proper porch by then, with a railing and 2 chairs, because she had said a house needed somewhere to sit outside and watch the day end, and he had agreed with the completeness of a man who wishes he had thought of it himself. They talked about Missouri, where he had grown up the third of 4 brothers, all of them scattered now across the West. They talked about Ohio, where she had grown up the oldest of 3 sisters and had developed, by necessity, the particular competence of the child who learns earliest that someone must manage. They talked about Clara, his first wife, with the gentle respect that the memory deserved, and she was glad that he could speak of her openly because it meant the grief had been processed rather than sealed, that there was room in him for new love because the old love had been properly honored. She told him things she had never told anyone. About the fear that had lived in her since childhood, the fear of precariousness, of being without ground, and how it had shaped every decision she had made since she was old enough to make decisions. He listened to all of it without trying to fix it or argue it away, which was the most sophisticated response available and also the rarest. "I think," she said one evening in late August, "that I have been afraid for so long that I forgot it was fear. I thought it was just what life felt like. And now," he said, she looked at the hills in the last light. "Now it feels different," she said. "Not safe exactly. I do not think safety is what the world offers, but grounded, like I am standing on something real." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the best thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "Better than anything," Clara said. She asked, because she could, because they had built the kind of trust between them where that question was honest and not hurtful. "Different," he said carefully. "Not better and not less. Different, you are different women and different kinds of love. There is room for both." She reached over and took his hand on the porch railing. "You are a more generous person than most," she said. "I had some practice at being otherwise," he said. "In Missouri, before I came out here, I was harder then, less willing to let things be complicated." He paused. "Losing Clara changed me. I do not recommend it as a method of personal improvement, but it was effective." Gertrude squeezed his hand. "I am glad you are who you are," she said, "however you arrived at it." Their son was born on the 15th of September, 1883, and they named him James, after David's father, with the middle name of William for Gertrude's grandfather, who had been the only man in her family history she remembered with uncomplicated affection. James was a large, loud, perfectly healthy baby who seemed from the first days of his life to have decided opinions about everything, which Gertrude found both exhausting and deeply satisfying, as though he were already demonstrating the independent character she had hoped to give him. Mrs. Forsyth came out for the birth and stayed 3 days, managing the house with the efficiency of a campaign general, while David hovered in the manner of a new father, who is trying very hard to be helpful, and is mostly successful. Mrs. Forsyth had become, over the previous year, something close to family, the nearest thing Gertrude had to a grandmother figure in this new life, a woman who offered practical support with the dryness of someone who does not sentimentalize, but feels things deeply regardless. "He looks like his father," Mrs. Forsyth said, examining James with the appraisal of a woman who has seen many babies. "He looks like a very small and extremely emphatic person," Gertrude said from the bed. "Yes," Mrs. Forsyth agreed. "That is also his father." David, from the doorway where he had been standing with the stunned expression of a new parent, made a small sound of protest that neither woman acknowledged. The autumn and winter of 1883 had the quality of something that had been built slowly enough to be solid. The cattle herd had grown to 22 head. The accounts were healthy, not wealthy. Not by any meaningful measure, but stable, sustainable, the kind of financial reality that lets you sleep rather than preventing it. James grew with the alarming speed of new things and was, by December, smiling with a deliberateness that suggested he had worked out that smiling produced results and intended to deploy it strategically. David read to him in the evenings, which was not something that Gertrude had expected, but which turned out to be one of the things she would remember longest about that first winter. The image of her husband sitting in the chair by the stove with James in the crook of his arm, and a book held in the other hand, reading in his steady voice. It did not matter what, because James was not interested in content at 4 months old, only in the sound, the reliable, warm continuance of his father's voice. In February of 1884, a letter arrived from Missouri. It was from David's brother Thomas, the eldest, and it contained news that was both expected and, in the event, more difficult than expected. Their mother was very ill and Thomas was asking whether David could come. Gertrude watched David read the letter and watched the shadow that crossed his face and said nothing until he had set the letter down. "How long will you need?" she said. He looked at her. "It would mean leaving you and James." "David," she said. "How long will you need?" He thought about it. "A month perhaps if the trains cooperate, maybe 6 weeks." "Go," she said. "James and I will be fine." "I know you will," he said. "That is not the question." "What is the question?" He was quiet. "I have not left this place since I arrived," he said, "and I do not want to leave this." "You are not leaving this," she said. "You are going to see your mother and then coming home. This will be here." He reached across the table and she thought he was going to take her hand again, but instead he touched her face gently, his thumb at her cheekbone in the way of someone memorizing something. "Yes," he said, "it will." He was gone for 7 weeks, which was longer than a month but shorter than 6 weeks' worth of fear. The letters came regularly. He had promised they would, and he was a man who kept his promises. And they were the letters of someone who, having found his voice for communication, deployed it fully. He wrote about Missouri with the precise sensory detail of a man who had once left a place and was now seeing it with the double vision of distance. He wrote about his mother, who was frailer than his memory of her but still recognizably herself, still sharp and occasionally formidable. He wrote about his brothers with the warmth and mild exasperation of the family dynamic that never entirely changes. He wrote about missing her. Not sentimentally. David was not a sentimental writer. His letters had the same quality as his speech, direct and considered, but simply, factually, in the way that honesty about emotional matters sometimes sounds like a report and is all the more moving for it. He missed her particular laugh. He missed the way she made decisions. He missed James with a specificity that she found she had to read while sitting down. She wrote back. She told him about James, who had begun making sounds that had the cadence of speech even without the content. She told him about the cattle and the accounts and the snow that had come in early March and sat on the hills in a way that was beautiful if inconvenient. She told him that Mrs. Forsythe had come out twice, and that Heinrich Baumann had helped her with a fence post that had been troubling her for 2 weeks. She told him that she had been reading his Roman Republic book and had opinions about Gaius Gracchus that she planned to share at length upon his return. She told him that she was all right and that she was missing him, and that this was the truth delivered straight. He came home on the first Tuesday of April. She heard the horse on the road before she saw him, because she had become, over the winter, attuned to the sounds of this specific stretch of Nevada, and a new horse on the road was distinct from the wind and the cattle and the settling of the cabin at night. She came to the door with James on her hip and watched David ride in, and when he saw her standing in the doorway with the baby and the spring afternoon behind them, he pulled up the horse and just looked for a moment, the way you look at something you are making sure is real. He was off the horse before it had fully stopped, and she had barely set James down on the porch before David's arms were around her, his face in her hair, holding her with the particular tightness of a return rather than a greeting. "You smell like wood smoke in spring," he said, into her hair. "You smell like train travel in Missouri," she said. "Neither of those things is a compliment." He laughed, still holding her, and James from the porch made a sound that was either greeting or complaint, and David let her go and picked up his son with the practiced ease of a man who had missed this specific weight and warmth. "Hello, James," he said. James grabbed his father's ear with the focused intentionality of a 6-month-old who has identified a satisfying target. "He has been doing that to everything," Gertrude said. "He gets that from you," David said. "The targeted approach." "Yes." She laughed and took his other hand, and they stood on the porch in the April afternoon, and she thought, "This is the life." Not any particular grand version of a life, not the Cincinnati life or the Elko life, or any of the lives she had tried on and discarded or been forced to flee. This one. This specific, built carefully, real as the Nevada hills life. His mother passed in May peacefully, and the letter came on a Saturday, and they sat together that evening with the difficulty of it, and she held his hand through the grief without trying to navigate him through it or out of it, just present, the way he had been present for her through her own difficult evenings. "She liked your letters," he said. "I read them to her when I was there. She said you wrote like a woman who knew her own mind." Gertrude felt this in her throat. "That is the finest compliment I have received in some time," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. "I am sorry she did not get to meet you." "So am I," she said, and meant it. The years that followed were not without difficulty. That would be too easy a thing to say about a life built in the Nevada high desert in the 1880s. But they were good years, solidly good, built on the foundation of two people who had each learned the hard way what they needed and had found it in each other. The cattle herd grew. David added a proper barn in 1885, a project that consumed 4 months and the help of 3 neighbors who received reciprocal labor in return. The cooperative economy of a region where self-sufficiency was a goal, but interdependence was a reality. Gertrude expanded the kitchen garden into something that could reasonably be called a productive kitchen garden, with tomatoes and beans and a row of sunflowers that she grew purely because she liked them, which was the kind of luxury she had learned to allow herself in small doses. She was contacted, in 1885, by a merchant in Carlin who had heard through Mrs. Forsyth that she kept impeccable accounts, and was offered a paid arrangement to keep his books on a weekly basis. She took it. The income was not large, but it was hers, specifically, and having a thing that was specifically hers felt important in a way she did not feel the need to explain to anyone, including David, who understood it without explanation. They disagreed sometimes, because they were two people with strong opinions and a shared life, which is the condition that produces disagreements with reliable frequency. They disagreed about how hard to push the cattle operation. She was more conservative, he was more willing to take calculated risk, and worked out a compromise that proved, in the event, to be better than either of their individual positions, which was the frustrating and satisfying outcome of real collaboration. They disagreed about whether James, at age 2.5, needed to be discouraged from climbing on the fence, and David's position, let him. That is how you learn, and Gertrude's position, prevent injury through reasonable intervention. Both turned out to be right at different times. In 1886, their second child arrived, another son, whom they named Robert, after a book of the Bible, and also after Robert Louis Stevenson, whose work David had recently received from San Francisco and was enthusiastically advocating for. Robert was a quieter baby than James had been, with a watchful quality that suggested he was taking notes, and David declared this very early that he was going to be the thoughtful one of the family. "James is going to be the one who does things," David said, holding newborn Robert while James, now 3, examined his new brother with cautious fascination. "And Robert is going to be the one who figures out why." "That is a great deal of projection for someone 3 hours old," Gertrude said from the bed. "I have very good instincts," David said. He was, she would reflect later, entirely correct about both of them. The year of 1887 brought something unexpected. A visit from David's brother Thomas, who had sold the Missouri farm after their mother's death and was looking west with the speculative eyes of a man who has decided one chapter is done and is open to the next. Thomas was older than David by 4 years. A tall, quiet man with more of their father's deliberateness and less of David's warmth, though the warmth was there underneath, slower to surface. He arrived in late spring with a wagon and a modest collection of possessions and the clear intention of staying for a while. Gertrude had arranged the new room, the one David had built on the cabin's east side in 1885, and presented Thomas with clean linens and a straight look and said, "You are welcome here for as long as you need to be, provided you contribute." Thomas had blinked. He was, she would learn, a man who was accustomed to the assumption that his presence was contribution enough. He was not, she would also learn, a man who was beyond adjusting this assumption once it was clearly challenged. "I am a capable carpenter," he said. "David is already a capable carpenter," she said. "What else can you do?" It turned out Thomas could handle horses better than anyone she had met, which was a genuine skill on a cattle ranch, and he settled into the operation with the slightly grudging willingness of a man who had not intended to work this hard but found, to his own surprise, that he did not actually resent it. He stayed for 2 years. In 1889, he married a woman named Agnes who ran the post office in Carlin, a no-nonsense widow in her early 30s who matched him in stubbornness and exceeded him in humor, and they built their own place 3 miles east, near enough to be neighbors and far enough to be individuals, which was the exactly correct geographic arrangement for family. James was 6 by then, and already possessed of the energy and intent of someone who had decided the world was a project he was personally responsible for completing. He helped with the cattle with a seriousness that made the older hands. They had hired 2 men by 1889, the herd having grown to 40 head, treat him with a respect that was partly genuine and partly affectionate. Robert was 3, and had developed the watchful quality that David had predicted, along with an unexpected gift for finding small things and examining them with the patient concentration of a born naturalist. In 1889, Gertrude also wrote a formal letter to the general merchant in Elko, not to Raymond Polk, who had apparently sold his ranch in 1884 and departed for parts unknown, but to the town itself, the community she had fled from in the dark of night with a borrowed horse and a cracked wagon wheel. She wrote because she had been asked to, by Mrs. Forsyth, who had a friend in Elko who had heard about her account-keeping, and because she had learned that the past held less power when you could walk back through it without flinching. She went to Elko in October of 1889, with David beside her on the wagon seat, and it was a very different experience from the last time she had traveled this road. They passed the spot where the wheel had cracked. She recognized it from the particular configuration of the hills and the rock formation at the road's edge, and she told him this was the place. He pulled the wagon to a stop and they sat there for a moment, looking at the unremarkable stretch of dirt road that had been the hinge of everything. 17 men rode past, she said. 17 fools, he said. You were the 18th, she said. I was running late, he said. I had stopped to fix a bridle buckle 2 miles back. If I had not stopped for that, I would have been 17 riders earlier and perhaps less inclined to notice anything. She looked at him. You would have stopped, she said. He thought about this seriously, which was very David. I would like to think so, he said, but I cannot be certain. People are often the product of circumstance as much as character. Then thank God for the bridle buckle, she said. Thank God for the bridle buckle, he agreed, and clicked the reins, and they drove on toward Elko in the October afternoon, past the sage and the long views and the sky that Nevada kept producing as though it were not possible for a sky to be this large, this blue, this unconcerned with the small, urgent lives beneath it. The Elko merchant was a pleasant man named Franklin who had a genuine problem with his accounts and was genuinely grateful for her help. And the 2-day trip was without incident or revelation, just the ordinary useful business of a practical woman applying a practical skill. They stayed at the hotel and ate supper in the dining room, and she did not feel anything particular about being in Elko except a mild historical interest, the way you feel about a place where something significant happened that is no longer significant. "Are you all right?" David asked at supper. "I am fine," she said. "I was thinking that places are less powerful than we give them credit for." The power was in the situation, not the location. "That is a reasonable analysis," he said. "The power was also in me," she said. "My willingness to run rather than fight. I was not wrong to run, I want to be clear about that. But I ran from things for a long time, and it was not until I stopped running that things actually changed." David looked at her across the hotel dining table with the evening lamplight between them. "You stopped," he said, "on the road. You stopped and you were there when I came along." "I had not stopped by choice," she said. "The wheel stopped me." "The wheel was the bridle buckle," he said. "Circumstance and character," she smiled. "You have become a philosopher." "I had a good teacher," he said. The 1890s came in with the particular quality of a decade that knew it was going somewhere, even if the somewhere was not yet entirely defined. Nevada had achieved statehood in 1864, and the country was still working out what that meant for the territories and the people in them, and the decade had a sense of things in motion, of the frontier closing by degrees without quite having admitted that it was closing. Gertrude felt this as something bittersweet, the way all changes feel when you have learned to love what you have. The Nevada she had arrived in 1882 had been rawer and more lawless, and the lawlessness had been genuinely dangerous. She knew this from experience. But it had also had a quality of possibility, of not yet decided, that was being slowly replaced by the established, the predictable, the institutional. She was not sure whether she mourned this or was relieved by it, and settled on both, held in the same hand. James, at 7, had declared that he wanted to be a rancher, which was the logical conclusion of a childhood spent in close proximity to cattle and the people who managed them. And David received this information with the quiet pride of a father who has tried not to want a particular thing from a child, and has discovered that the wanting was there regardless, and is now being met. Robert, at 4, had declared that he wanted to be a doctor, which came as a surprise to everyone and perhaps to Robert himself, who seemed to have arrived at this conclusion through a private process that he was not entirely ready to share. He had, however, been treating injured birds for several months with a focus that suggested the career path was genuine. "A doctor," Gertrude said to David that evening. "A doctor," he agreed with the same wondering quality. "We will need to think about education," she said, because she was always the one who thought about the practical implications of the future. "We have time," he said. "We need to think about it now," she said. "Good schooling is not an accident. It requires planning." He did not argue because she was right, and he had learned, they had both learned, the difference between the things worth arguing about and the things worth simply agreeing on and then working together to solve. This was the latter. She was expecting their third child by the spring of 1891. She was 36 years old, which she was aware was older than most women in that era were having children. And the doctor in Carlin, a new doctor now, younger than the previous one, a man named Dr. Albrecht who had studied in San Francisco and had the up-to-date manner of someone trained in recent medical thinking, was cautiously reassuring without being dismissive of the practical realities. "You are healthy and your previous pregnancies were uncomplicated," he said. "I see no reason for particular concern, but we will pay attention." She appreciated the honesty. She told David the same thing when she told him the news. She was healthy, the doctor was cautiously reassuring, they would pay attention. David held her hands in both of his at the kitchen table and said, "What do you need from me?" She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "The same thing you always give me," she said. To be here, to be honest, to not treat me as though I am fragile just because the situation requires care." "Done," he said. Their third child was a daughter, born in December of 1891. They named her Clara, which was David's suggestion, and which Gertrude received without any complicated feelings, because she had never had complicated feelings about Clara. David's first wife had been a real person who deserved a real remembrance, and naming their daughter for her felt like an act of wholeness rather than haunting. Clara arrived in the world with a quietness that was somehow completely distinct from Robert's watchfulness. It was the quietness of someone who is comfortable, who has arrived and is pleased with the arrangement. The decade unfolded around them in the way that good decades do, full of the ordinary texture that becomes, in retrospect, the richest part. James grew into exactly the rancher he had declared he would be, with David's competence and Gertrude's strategic thinking, combined in a way that made him formidable at 15 and genuinely impressive at 17. He was a fair-minded boy who treated the hired hands with the respect he expected in return, and who had David's habit of listening before speaking, which was the most valuable habit any person could have. Robert had not abandoned his intention to be a doctor. He read everything he could find, which was limited in Carlin, but expanded considerably when Gertrude, who had by 1893 established a small but real reputation as an accounts keeper for several Carlin businesses, and whose income had become a substantive contribution to the ranch's finances, arranged for a subscription to several medical journals through the San Francisco bookshop that had been supplying David's reading for over a decade. She did not announce this. She left the journals on Robert's desk one morning and said nothing, and he came to find her that evening and stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said, in his careful voice, "Thank you, Mother," with a weight in it that told her he understood entirely what the gesture meant. Clara, at 5, had the quality of someone who was watching everything and storing it, which Gertrude recognized as her own quality transmitted by inheritance, and which she received with the mixed feelings of a woman who knows what that particular characteristic costs and also what it enables. In 1895, David's brother Thomas had a daughter, their first child after several years of trying, and the joy of this rippled through both families in the way that long-awaited things do, with the particular sweetness of the finally arrived. Thomas came to tell them himself, riding the 3 miles in the early morning with an expression that had dismantled his usual composure entirely. And David met him in the yard, and they embraced the way brothers do who have not always known how to do it, with the slight awkwardness and complete sincerity of men who have grown up past the age where showing feeling was comfortable, and have arrived at the age where they do it anyway. Agnes was delivered safely by the same Dr. Albrecht who had attended Gertrude, and the baby girl was named Frances, and she was a robust, opinionated baby who told you exactly what she thought of every situation, and within 6 months Thomas was clearly both exhausted and besotted. "You looked exactly like that," Gertrude told David at supper one evening after a visit. "Did I?" he said. "Exactly like that," she confirmed. "Tired beyond what you thought was possible and unable to believe you had been this lucky." He looked at her across the table, the kitchen table, the good one he had built in 1884, solid and still steady, and smiled. "That description is still accurate," he said. "Tired beyond what you thought was possible," she said. "Unable to believe I have been this lucky," he said. She looked at him in the kitchen lamplight, this man she had known for 13 years, who had stopped when 17 others had not, who had offered 4 simple words on a Nevada road and meant them with the entirety of a person who does not say things he does not mean. She had gray in her hair now, and he had lines at the corners of his eyes, and they were both more thoroughly themselves than they had been at 28 and 32, which was the only honest definition of growing older that she had ever found satisfactory. "I married you for entirely practical reasons," she said. "A kitchen with an east window and a man who kept his promises." "I know," he said. "The impractical reasons came later," she said. "I know that too," he said, still smiling. "I love you," she said plainly, the way she always said it, not as a performance but as a fact being stated for the record, the way you put something in a ledger because it is true and you want it accounted for. "I love you," he said the same way. James was 18 in 1901, which was the year that Gertrude sat down and thought seriously about the shape of the life she had built and found it, on a careful accounting, to be extraordinary. Not in the way of the lives that appear in the dime novels that had made their way west in increasing numbers, not with the drama of villainy defeated and passion triumphant and justice delivered with a pistol shot. Extraordinary in the way of real things, carefully constructed, genuinely maintained, full of the specific texture of two people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and continued choosing, day after day, with the same intention. James was running half the ranch operation by then, with a seriousness and competence that told her he was ready for it to be fully his in time, in the natural progression of things. Robert was 19 and had been accepted to study medicine in San Francisco, which had required the careful planning she had started 13 years earlier and had been worth every part of it. He would leave in September, and the leaving was going to be hard. She was honest with herself about this. But it was also the exact right thing, the culmination of a plan made in love and executed through deliberate effort. Clara was 9 and possessed of the watchful quality Gertrude had recognized in her from birth, combined with a directness that was purely David's, and was currently of the opinion that she wanted to be a teacher, which Gertrude thought was very possibly true and also not the whole story yet, because Clara at 9 was at the beginning of knowing herself rather than the middle or the end. In the September of 1901, they stood as a family on the Carlin Railroad platform and saw Robert off to San Francisco on the Southern Pacific, and Gertrude held herself together with the practiced composure of a woman who has learned the difference between feelings that need to be expressed and feelings that need to be endured, and this was the latter. She held together until the train had rounded the curve out of sight, and then David put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and breathed and let the composure do what composure does when it has served its purpose. "He is going to be a wonderful doctor," she said, into David's shoulder. "He is already wonderful," David said. "The doctor part is additional," she laughed, a little damply. James stood on her other side with the quietly anguished expression of a brother who would rather chew glass than cry in public, and Clara held David's hand and watched the empty track with the focused attention of someone committing a moment to memory. The fall of 1901 was cool and clean and beautiful in the way that Nevada falls sometimes managed, when the light went gold and the sage turned a dusty purple, and the mornings had a crispness that felt like the world's version of a fresh start. Gertrude walked the property in the early mornings as she had always done, James having taken over the primary cattle work, and she used these walks for the thinking she had always done best in motion. She thought about the life she had built and felt, without grandiosity, that it was good. She thought about the woman she had been in 1882, standing on the road with her satchel and her secrets and her $42, watching riders tip their hats and keep going, and she felt for that woman the clear-eyed compassion you feel for your own past self, the recognition of someone doing the best they could with what they had, which was also all anyone could ever do. She thought about David, who was at this moment building a new fence section in the north pasture with James, because David at 52 still built things with his hands and intended to continue doing so for as long as the hands cooperated, and who would come in for supper this evening smelling of sawdust and honest work, and sit down across from her with the same presence he had brought to every meal they had shared for 19 years. She thought about the east window in the kitchen and how the morning light still came through it in the way he had described before the room was even built, and how that accuracy, the promise kept before it could even be tested, had been the first real sign of what she was getting into. She walked back to the house with the morning light at her back and the smoke from the kitchen chimney rising into the clean blue sky. And she climbed the porch steps and went through the door and put the coffee on, and began the day. The years that settled in after that had the quality of something well-made being used for its intended purpose. Not exciting in the manner of beginnings and crises, but deeply, sustainably good. Robert wrote from San Francisco with the steady frequency of a man who had inherited his mother's discipline, about correspondence and his father's ear for detail, and his letters described a life of study and growing competence, and the occasional wonder of learning something that changed how you understood everything else. He was, his professors apparently agreed, exceptionally capable, and this news arrived in letters that were modest in a way that told you the professors were not. James in 1903 fell in love with a young woman named Harriet, the daughter of one of the neighboring ranchers, a practical and warm-hearted woman who could ride as well as James could, and had the directness of someone who has spent her life outdoors and has not learned to soften her observations for indoor consumption. Gertrude liked her immediately and entirely, which she mentioned to David. "You like her because she reminds you of yourself," he said. "I like her because she is honest and capable and treats James with a respect that is not servility," Gertrude said. "If those qualities remind you of me, I take that as a compliment to us both." He smiled. "As intended," he said. James and Harriet were married in the spring of 1904, in the same Carlin church where Gertrude and David had been married 22 years earlier, with Robert returning from San Francisco for the occasion and Mrs. Forsythe in attendance, now in her 70s, and as squared-shouldered and formidable as she had always been, with the additional quality of a woman who has seen enough to know what is worth celebrating. At the wedding supper, Mrs. Forsythe took Gertrude's hand and said, in her dry, direct way, "I knew when I saw the two of you at that breakfast table in 1882 that this was going to come to something." "You knew nothing of the sort," Gertrude said. "It was far too early." "I knew," Mrs. Forsythe said firmly. "You did not look at him the way a woman looks at a practical arrangement. You looked at him the way a woman looks at something she is trying not to want." Gertrude considered this. "That is an accurate description," she said. "I am almost always accurate," Mrs. Forsythe said. "It is my primary quality." Robert came back to Nevada in 1905, which was not what anyone had expected. San Francisco had seemed like his natural destination, the city that matched his pace and his interests. But he had been offered a position as doctor in Elko, of all places, and had taken it with the deliberate quality that characterized every significant decision he made. Elko needed a doctor, he wrote. The town had grown, but the medical services had not kept pace. He was needed there, and being needed was, for Robert, the closest thing to a calling he had found. He settled in Elko and built a practice, and in 1907 married a woman named Elena, who was the daughter of a Spanish ranching family that had been in Nevada longer than the town of Elko itself. A dark-eyed, composed woman with a quiet humor that found Robert's watchful seriousness to be the exactly right complement. They had a daughter in 1908 whom they named Gertrude, which was when Gertrude Thatcher Merritt cried in a way she had not anticipated and did not try to prevent. Clara, who had grown into exactly the person her childhood had promised she would be, both more and different from anyone's predictions, went to teachers' college in Reno in 1902 and came back in 1905 with a certificate and a trunk of books and the intention of teaching at the Carlin School, which she proceeded to do with a dedication and effectiveness that made her, within 5 years, the most respected educator in that part of Nevada. She did not, in the first decade of her career, show any particular interest in marriage, and Gertrude, who understood the specific satisfaction of useful work that is entirely one's own, did not press her. She found her own way eventually, as people who know themselves always do. In 1912, Clara at 20 met and married a journalist named Frederick Halloran, who had come through Carlin on his way to covering the copper mining situation and had stayed considerably longer than his assignment required, largely because of a conversation with a schoolteacher that he apparently found impossible to conclude. David in the later years, the 1900s, the decade that felt to Gertrude like the final chapter of the West she had arrived in, and the first chapter of something else, David built things still, though more carefully now, with the precision of a man who has learned to conserve the energy that younger men spend freely. The ranch was James's to run in the daily operational sense, but David's presence was still central in the way that the presence of someone who built a thing is always central. He knew where everything was and why, and this knowledge was not information that could be fully transferred but had to be sought out, asked for, drawn from the person who held it. He and Gertrude sat on the porch in the evenings still, as they had done since he had built the porch in 1883. The chairs had been replaced twice. The view of the hills was unchanged. They talked, still, about everything and nothing, about the grandchildren, about the books that still arrived from San Francisco, about the state of the cattle operation and the accounts, about the particular quality of the light on a given evening, about the Roman Republic and everything that had happened since. She told him once in the spring of 1908, watching the evening come over the hills, that she still thought about the road sometimes. The wagon road between Elko and Carlin, the cracked wheel, the 17 riders. "What do you think about it?" he asked. "I think about what would have happened if the wheel had not cracked," she said. "I would have made it to Carlin on a whole wheel and taken the stage somewhere and started over somewhere else and never been sitting by the road when you came along. Or I would have found you somewhere else," he said. "You might not have," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I am grateful for the wheel," he said. "I am grateful for the wheel," she agreed, "and for the bridle buckle, and for the 17 riders," he said, "who tipped their hats and kept going." She laughed. "Yes, for them too. Without them, you would merely have been a man who helped someone with a wagon wheel. Instead, you were the man who stopped when no one else did, and that is a different thing entirely." He reached for her hand on the porch railing as he had done on the first day, as he had done 1,000 times since, the same gesture, with the same certainty, made more rather than less significant by repetition, because the things that remain consistent across years are the things that are genuinely true. "I would stop again," he said. "Every time, on every road." She held his hand and looked at the hills going dark in the evening light and felt the entirety of it. The cracked wheel and the cold stone of secrets carried and set down, the Ohio farm and Cincinnati and Raymond Polk's flat face, the 17 riders and the 18th, the east window in the kitchen and the morning light that came through it every single day without fail, the sons who had become their own men and the daughter who had become entirely herself, the grandchildren and the letters from San Francisco and the Roman Republic, and all the books and all the evenings, and all the ordinary extraordinary days of a life that had been built carefully and well. "I know you would," she said. "That is the whole of it." The hills went dark. The stars came out over the Nevada desert with the prodigal generosity they had always shown, uncountable and brilliant, the same stars that had been there when the wagon wheel cracked and the road was empty and 17 men had tipped their hats and kept going. The same stars that had watched a woman with $42 and a satchel full of secrets decide to say yes to help offered plainly and without condition. The same stars that now looked down on a porch where two people sat holding hands in the particular comfortable silence of those who have nothing left to prove to each other and a great deal left to say, and all the time in the world to say it. Gertrude Thatcher Merritt, 53 years old, rancher's wife, account keeper, mother of 3, grandmother of an infant girl who bore her name, sat beside her husband in the Nevada night and was, in the fullest and most unqualified sense of the word, home. David Merritt held her hand and watched the stars and thought, as he sometimes did, about the bridle buckle and the road, and the woman sitting by the broken wagon with her spine perfectly straight, and her chin up and her green dress dusty, and the moment he had pulled his horse to a stop, and asked the question that had changed everything. Not a dramatic moment. Not a moment with guns or villains or the kind of music that dime novels implied should accompany significant events. Just a man on a horse on a Nevada road asking a woman in trouble whether she needed help. Just that. Just the whole world in 4 words. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The stars continued their impartial and magnificent display, indifferent to the smallness of the lives beneath them, and in their indifference, somehow making those lives more rather than less miraculous. Each one a specific, impossible, unrepeatable arrangement of circumstance and character, and the grace of a cracked wheel at exactly the right moment on exactly the right road, where one man, unlike the 17 before him, chose to stop.